Could I have your attention, please? Good morning all, and welcome to the second day of the 4th International Conference on Climate Change. I hope everybody had a good night's rest and had a chance to consider the terrific presentations that we heard last night from Harrison Schmidt and Steve McIntyre. I don't know about you, but it kept me awake for quite a few minutes afterwards to try to parse everything that turned out. You'll be glad to know that Heathrow Airport has reopened, so we've got a chance to get back. There was some news report that said a message was scrawled in Icelandic language and left in Paris. It said, "Put $10 trillion in small bills in the middle of Paris and we'll turn off the volcano." There's no truth to that, however, I understand. This begins the first full day, the second day of the conference, and I presume everybody has their agenda and can try to pick what they're going to see. As somebody pointed out yesterday, you're going to miss 3/4 of the conference because we've got 4 tracks going simultaneously throughout the day, plus a terrific lunch presentation, and dinner tonight, as you remember, is on your own. I want to remind you that Dr. Mike Fox from the Grassroots Institute in Hawaii is in very bad shape, fighting cancer, which was in remission for a while and now has come back virulently. Mike would very much like to hear from anybody, and Janet Nelson, his friend, is maintaining a Good Wishes book. That's by the registration desk in the media section on the 5th floor. I hope you'll stop by, and there she is, Janet. Once again, Janet, stand up, please, and sign that book. Let Mike know that as a real patriot, as someone who has fought for sound science and data as opposed to computer models and junk science, he'd like to hear from all of us, even if you don't know him personally. He certainly would appreciate a note in the book, so I hope you'll take time to sign that. You're going to hear 2 presenters today, Governor John Allen and Pat Michaels. Governor Allen is the one who left this document on your table, which outlines the price per kilowatt hour for what is being paid for energy in the 50 states, and it's absolutely stunning. And I urge you to look at that, find your state now, because it'll be very pertinent when Governor Allen speaks. But first, Pat Michaels is going to join us. Pat Michaels is a distinguished senior fellow in the School of Public Policy at George Mason University. He earned his doctorate in ecological climatology from the University of Wisconsin in 1979. Pause for wild applause. Yes, Joe. Pat is the past president of the American Association of State Climatologists and was the program chair for the Committee of Applied Climatology of the American Meteorological Society. Pat also logged 30 years as a research professor of environmental science at the University of Virginia. And he's a contributing author and reviewer of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2007. Pat is not wearing his medal right now. Pat also has one other distinguishing characteristic. He's one of the most articulate, most enthusiastic presenters of sound science on climate change in the world. Please welcome Pat Michaels.
Many thanks. It's an honor to be here, and I really enjoy these Heartland presentations. If I could have my PowerPoints up, I would appreciate that. Here we are talking about cap and trade, regulation of greenhouse gases, and the absolute lack of science that's behind them. I am a distinguished senior fellow at George Mason now, which means that's translated as old fart. And I'm also with the Cato Institute. Anyway, next slide. Where is the clicker? Oh, here it is. Never mind. There we go. Let's talk about cap and trade for a second. This is Waxman Markey. The House bill passed late on Friday afternoon, last June 26th, so that it would be hidden from the news cycle. It wasn't. As soon as the Congress people went home to their districts, they first faced faced the first angry town hall meetings. They were not about health care, they were about cap and trade. Well, Waxman Markey reduces emissions to 3% below 2005 levels in 2012, and 16%, 16%, come on, go backwards, in 2020, all the way to 83% below in 2050. Now you may ask, how big a reduction is that in per capita emissions? Well, here are per capita emissions back to 1800, and you can...
You've got a thing there, and you're on live TV now, and if you can stand by the podium.
Oh, I was told I could move. Oh, well. All right. Okay. Well, what are the per capita emissions that this would allow? You can see 2005 there. You can see the reduction for 2012, 2020, 2030, and 2050. By 2050, 39 years from today, the average American gets the average per capita emissions of the average American in 1867. How are we going to accomplish this? That's a good question. I'll tell you how we're going to accomplish this with a story. On live television, there is an object that you have, which means you've won the debate. I asked a colleague of mine, an environmentalist from Wisconsin, precisely what technologies and what pathway we would go on to reduce the per capita emissions of Americans to 17% of what they were in 2005 to 1867 levels, and he looked at the camera and went, that's the answer, because no one knows. Now, however, these are our annual emissions, and you can see at 2005, 6, 7, 8, 2009, why they dropped between 2008 and 2009. In fact, they dropped 7% because our economy went in the tank. And so, in the brand new cap and trade bill by Kerry and Lieberman that was submitted last week, they have an extra little twist. It has about a 5% reduction by 2013. That's easy. All they're telling you is the economy is going to stay in the tank. How much would this do if we, in fact, actually did what it says in Waxman Markey or in Kerry Lieberman? This is by the year 2050. This is according to the United Nations. By the way, the acronym for the United Nations Impact Assessment Model for various climate scenarios, I am not making this up, is MAGIC. Using the United Nations MAGIC model, you know, everybody laughs when I give a talk. You're supposed to be crying. Anyway, and the United States only does what's in there. The warming, if we did nothing, would be 1.58 degrees. If we did Waxman Markey, it would be 1.54 degrees. So we would save a grand total of 0.04 of a degree. Now, suppose every country in the world that has obligations under the Kyoto Protocol does Waxman Markey. Then the warming would be 1.5 degrees, or an 0.08 of a degree reduction. And by 2100, the figures are the same. Warming of 2.96 degrees under business as usual, 2.74 degrees if every nation of the world that did the Kyoto Protocol does Waxman Markey. That's a number that's too small to measure. So, then the question becomes the obvious one. How much does doing nothing cost? And here, you guys fill out federal forms all the time. You know, the most important words in life probably are not I love you, they're probably I don't know, and I don't know. So, as a result, it's going to go from Congress to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. You know, really, no senator really wants to have the blood of the economy on their hands. However, if we can give it to a faceless agency, then it's harder to blame anyone but the president, and he's going to be blamed anyway for a number of other things, so it's just an additional blame. And EPA has already issued what was called an endangerment finding. They did this on December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day last year, also the day that the Copenhagen Convention on Climate Change began. That's the one that President Obama went to, and he was soundly rebuffed. The success of that conference is poignantly illustrated by a photograph that many of you have seen, which was Air Force One landing in the blizzard in Washington, D.C. He had to leave early. They said, you got to go, otherwise you're not getting home. And they left with virtually no agreement. Anyway, EPA was commissioned to make its pronouncement at the beginning of the Kyoto conference, or the Copenhagen conference, to show that we really meant what we were doing. And here is the key statement in their finding. Most of the observed increase in global average temperature since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. Fine, thank you, EPA. You just gave us a testable hypothesis. As last I understand, the word most means more than 50%. And according to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, of which I am a member, proving that all garden parties need a skunk, very likely means between 90 and 95% subjective probability. So, here is the warming in the East Anglia climate record. Whether or not you believe this is a subject for later on in this talk. But from 1950 through now, if you pass a straight line through the data, it has a warming trend of 0.70 degrees Celsius. Fine. Now, right after the IPCC report came out, and that statement about most of the warming comes from the IPCC AR4 report. Right after that came out, Thompson et al. Published a paper in Nature magazine in which they demonstrated that the sea surface temperatures that they were measuring from 1945 to 1965 were being measured too cold. So that means the record in the mid-1950s starts off too cold. So we can account for this. And you can back calculate through their paper, and you see that drops the warming by about 21%. And so the adjusted warming rate is now 55%, the adjusted warming trend in the IPCC data. Fine. Ross McKittrick and I, around the same time, published a paper in Journal of Geophysical Research, Atmospheres, with the following proposition. Let me explain this to you. And you guys ever seen a weather station? It's a white box that sits 4.5 feet above the ground. It's a white box so that it doesn't absorb solar radiation and artificially raise the temperature inside of it. And they all look very nice and white and pristine here in the United States and Canada and in Europe. Can I ask you a question? How high on the economic priority list do you think it is to keep the weather station painted white in Chad? It's not. And so McKittrick and I found basically that the poorer the country is, the more warming their temperature records show when compared with satellite data. And so we could adjust that out. Now remember that that's only land data. They're not white boxes over the ocean. And that drops the warming to 0.47 degrees. Now I want to point out that that's completely independent from mismeasuring the sea surface temperatures. So these are additive errors. And then Susan Solomon, with NOAA, a modeler, in January published a paper in Science magazine which said, you know, it hasn't really warmed very much in the last 12 years. She had gone to the last Heartland conference. And the reason for this is because of water vapor in the stratosphere and the upper troposphere. That's the layer beneath the stratosphere, that the water vapor has declined. What does this have to do with human greenhouse emissions? Okay? Exactly. We don't know. However, that reduces the warming an additional few percent, and you're now down to 0.40 degrees, 0.41 out of 0.7 degrees worth of warming. This, again, is completely independent of the fact that Chad doesn't paint the weather station. It's completely independent of the fact that the sea surface temperatures were measured too cold. And then Ramanathan, out at Scripps, decided to measure the effect of black carbon in the air. That's not a greenhouse gas either. It's black dust that you emit when you burn things. And he summarized the literature in a meta-analysis, as we call it, and concluded that that was responsible for 25% of the observed warming. So now we are down to 0.30 degrees instead of 0.7. Oops. Most of the warming is not attributable to changes in greenhouse gas concentrations. We'll see them in court, okay, with your support. Now notice I didn't do one thing that's very popular here. I didn't even bring in variation in the sun. That's because, in my opinion, the influence of the sun on these records is known, but only with a large range of error. Now, if I take the mid-range value from Scafetta and West for the influence of the sun since 1950, and again, I don't even have to do this, you're down to 0.2 degrees out of 0.7. So the fact that most of the warming, 50%, is very likely, that's a 90% probability due to changes in greenhouse gases, just isn't right. Now, thank you. You know, you should be cheering for the atmosphere. I really didn't do this, okay? And then there are the old war horses of global warming, hurricanes, polar ice, and tornadoes. And I just thought I'd show you a little bit on these. This is something called the ACE index, the Accumulated Cyclone Energy Index. It's the wind speed in the storm squared times the amount of time a storm has a certain wind speed. It's very straightforward. And the ACE index for the globe is here on the top, and the ACE index for the northern hemisphere, meaning the Atlantic and Pacific hurricane basins, is on the bottom. And you can see where we are right now. This here is the big year of 2005. This is 1995, the mid-1990s, when something called the North Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation switched from a position of producing very few powerful hurricanes to producing powerful hurricanes. And then, since then, it's declined. In fact, hurricane activity is as low as it has been since the ACE index started up. Next. Ice. Oh, yes. Northern Hemisphere sea ice in the Arctic Ocean is declining dramatically. As Casey Stengel would say, you could look it up. How many people in here know who Casey Stengel was? Thank God I'm not a senior fellow yet. Okay. In the northern hemisphere, there is a decline. There is a decline in sea ice, although the most recent measurements have it pretty near its long-term mean. This is the departure from average for a given time, so it's adjusted for the seasonal cycle. But nobody ever bothers to talk about the southern half of the planet. Al Gore once saw a satellite image in which the southern hemisphere was on the top side, and he said, "You've got the Earth upside down." Like I said, I'm not making this up. You should be crying. He's selling carbon credits. Anyway, this is the southern hemisphere ice index. You can look this up, again, as Stengel said. Look under Cryosphere Today online, and you can check it up on a day-by-day basis, and you see, my God, that line looks like it's going up. In fact, it is. It's going up in a statistically significant fashion. It is extremely likely, according to the United Nations, that sea ice in the southern hemisphere is increasing. And it's possible that most of that increase might have to do with the fact that if you warm the ocean up a little bit in the southern hemisphere, a couple of degrees, and that moisture is converged over land, just like when moisture from Lake Michigan backs off into Chicago. Do you think it rains in the winter when that happens? No. In Antarctica, all that increased precipitation falls as snow. So it shouldn't shock you that Antarctic sea ice cover is increasing. Tornadoes. If I showed the number of tornadoes reported on the Weather Channel, it would be going up dramatically, but so are the number of times that Missy the cat almost died in a storm. Oh, poor Missy almost died. Oh, well, anyway. But we really want to look at the number of severe tornadoes, because the reason there are more tornadoes is because there's more radar. You know, we hardly had any tornadoes until 1953, which is when there were 3 tornadoes, one in Worcester, Massachusetts, one in Waco, Texas, and one in Flint, Michigan. 2 of those places aren't supposed to get them, and hundreds of people were killed. And so the the Weather Bureau went in front of Congress and said, if we could put out radar, we would see tornadoes. And so a device was developed called the WSR-57, WSR 1957 radar. Boy, did the number of tornadoes go up in 1957. And then it stabilized as WSRs covered the country, and by 1988, they wanted Doppler radar, WSD-88, and the number of tornadoes jumps in the late 1990s, prompting movies like The End of the World or something like that. Well, anyway, what you really want to look at are the severe tornadoes, because those were going to be detected anyway, obviously. And these are the category 3, 4, and 5 tornadoes on the Fujita scale. Here's the mega outbreak of 1974, and you can see actually there appears to be some secular decline in the frequency of big-time tornadoes. Well, what does all this mean for the future? And I will tell you, that warming trend that we have, if you assume that it is largely from greenhouse gases, if you assume that, it's a straight line warming. Our computer models tell us, because of the logarithmic response of temperature to carbon dioxide and a slight exponential increase in carbon dioxide, for several $billion a year, scientists are able to tell you what anybody who takes pre-calculus knows, which is that a logarithm and an exponent have a tendency to add up to a straight line. And there you see where we are. We're on the low end of the colored spaghetti. Now that allows me to ask a very interesting question, which is this, which is the following. Whoops. Why is the warming so low? Well, there are three reasons for this, and they're going to be covered at this conference. Number one is the systematic bias in the computer models themselves. Chip Knappenberger, my researcher, is going to talk to you about that. Overestimation of sensitivity of carbon dioxide, of temperature to carbon dioxide. Dick Lindzen and Roy Spencer will discuss this. That, to me, is a key in this issue. You know how that sensitivity to carbon dioxide, that's the amount of temperature change per watt per meter squared radiation change induced by carbon dioxide. You know how that is estimated in the computer models, don't you? Okay. We make up a number, and the number just happens to give a fair amount of warming. If you actually empirically try to derive the number, and as Dick Lindzen will probably show you, you tend to get about 1/3 of the sensitivity that is generally used in the computer models, and shockingly enough, the warming tends to be about 1/3 of the median value predicted in the models. So there's another reason why it isn't warming. Oh, sorry, I have to go back. I didn't put a name on that because it's just going to be me. It's overestimation of emissions. And let's talk about that. Atmospheric methane is the second most important greenhouse gas. It has four major sources: bovine flatulence. Fred Singer in this audience was the person, this is really a creative audience, was the person who coined that many years ago. That's not going down. The number of bovines is going up. Rice paddy agriculture, and that's not going down. Coal mining, we capture some of the methane at the mine mouth now, but not all of it. And the notion that the old Soviet Union had leaky gas transmission pipes. And that as it turned into this wonderful society of free people living shorter and shorter lives, they cleaned up their pipes. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I got a bridge I'd like to sell you too. But anyway, okay, every scientist, methane is going up and up and up and up and up. Okay, from 1900 to 1988. Which was when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was started up. By the way, if you read the charter for the IPCC, it says the purpose of the IPCC is to provide the scientific background for a possible framework convention on climate change. In other words, the job description was, give us an excuse to write a treaty to regulate all your lives. And if you think that they weren't going to do that, you're somewhat naive, because they'd find somebody else to do that, to sit in the front of the airplane and to go to Geneva and God knows what other nights, to Bali or wherever, to meet twice a year. At any rate, so everybody thinks that methane is going up in the atmosphere and that it's going to continue to go up. Well, this is 1988 right here. You can see it's been going up very nicely. And so the projections in 1988 was that it would continue to go up as a straight line. And then as soon as the scientific community said that it had a consensus, that it knew the truth, nature said, here's what I think of your consensus, which is nice about nature. And the increase in methane began to decline. Nonetheless, the United Nations IPCC, whose motto should be damn the data, full speed ahead, decided that this was the range of methane increase that was going to occur from the late 1990s to now. As you can see, it was completely wrong. Completely wrong. The observed increase flattened out, and in fact, if you take a look at it on a short-term basis, there are some cases where the increase is actually negative, where the methane concentration declines, declines in the atmosphere over short periods. Do you know why methane is going down in the atmosphere? No one knows. but it is. Shows how much the consensus of scientists is good for. And then there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Oh, I was at a talk where Bob Carell in New Orleans on Friday, he used to run the climate program for the government, put up a slide and showed how emissions are increasing in the atmosphere at a rate faster than we thought. You don't care about emissions. You care about the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's what presumably forces the warming. So let's take a look at the projected concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by the United Nations IPCC. When they began to make them in the mid-1990s, the red line is reality, the blue line is the United Nations, and again you can see in this case the observed concentration in the atmosphere is running at the absolute low end of the range of projections that was made. So even if you believe all the warming is caused from atmospheric carbon dioxide and methane and greenhouse gases, it follows logically that it will be at or below the lowest levels of warming that were projected by the IPCC. And if you take Tip's talk in, which I hope you will, he will demonstrate that very nicely. Now, I know you all want to talk about this, climate temperature histories and ClimateGate and a little bit more ClimateGate. And I want to show you what caused one of the major causes of ClimateGate in 3 brief slides. If you were a scientist in 1995, you would have 3 temperature records to work with. You'd have the land surface record, which is this one from the University of East Anglia. That's the one that's most cited, CITED, in the literature. You would have the green one, which are temperatures measured by weather balloons, and you would have the red one, which are satellite temperature measurements that begin in 1975. Well, the surface record doesn't do much, in fact, 1979. The surface record doesn't do much until 1975. Then you can see the blue line starts to go up. The red line, by the way, these red, green, and blue lines are referenced to different means. One's not warmer than the other. That's taken from a different averaging period for each one. The red line doesn't change at all, nor does the green line change at all. So the blue line's going up. So if you were a scientist in 1995, you would say, well, there's probably something wrong with the land record, because 2 other independent records show no warming. These were the people that were apparently making things up. All they were doing were being really conscientious scientists. If you have 2 temperature records that say something's not happening and one that says something is, you generally suspect the one that says something is. Well then, by the time the next IPCC report came around, these records were modified, particularly the CRU record, the surface record. And I'm going to go forwards and backwards between 2000 and now. I want you to look at the blue line on the left, right around 1950. And what you see, oh my God, the same data got colder. That's right. The same numbers got colder, and people were beginning to ask, how in the world did that happen? Then between 2000 and 2005, it was discovered that the weather balloon records in the tropics had too much noise in the data. Remember the problem with the Chad weather station? So the idea was to throw out all the tropical weather balloon data. Well, anybody who knows very much about climate science knows that global warming is projected to be greater in the high latitudes than it is in the tropics. So what you succeeded in doing was throwing out all the data that didn't show any warming. And then the weather balloon, or the satellite rather, was found to have a bias in it. It was scraping the top of the atmosphere a little bit, and its orbit was drifting so that it wasn't quite measuring the temperature at the same time every day at the right time. And Roy Spencer and everybody has corrected that. Now, by the time you're in 2006, you're now a scientist, and take a look at what happens to these temperature records. This is, by the way, why Al Gore goes around and says all scientists believe in global warming. That's like saying all scientists believe the sun is very likely going to rise tomorrow morning, unless, of course, they live near the North Pole in the summer or the winter. But anyway, this forms that basis. First, when I flip, I want you to watch the blue. And then when I flip it back again, I want you to watch the green. Here we go. Look at the blue. Take a look at what happened in 5 years with the same temperature data. Okay? I'll go back twice. Blue, blue. And look at the green. What happens when you throw out the data that doesn't show any warming? Shocking. It gets warmer. Yeah, see the green? It's the beginning of the record. Look at the green change dramatically. And then the satellite shows some warming, but not the same rate as the other ones. So yes, all scientists agree. Well, this behavior was not unnoticed by me and my apparently few friends. And so one of my few friends, Warwick Hughes from Australia, wrote to Phil Jones, the head of the CRU, Climate Research Unit in the United Kingdom, and said, I don't know how this happened. Could you please send me the raw data? And then he got this email back. We have 25 years or so invested in the work. Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try and find something wrong with this? Now, this is not in the ClimateGate emails. This is a separate email that was not included in the ClimateGate package. So it leads me to wonder what else is in the emails that we haven't seen. At any rate, the response was, first off, no, you can't have it. And then when another request was made and McIntyre started to make requests, they were told, well, no, we have confidentiality agreements with the countries that sent it to us. And then McIntyre and McKittrick got their friends together, and they can only ask for 6 specific items, so they asked for the first A, B, C, D countries, and then the DEF countries. And anyway, it turns out that there were confidentiality agreements, 6 of them, mostly with small African countries, and one with Spain, a gigantic figure on the global map. And then East Anglia responded and said, well, actually, we didn't have computer space in the mid-1980s, and so we don't have the original data. Instead, what we have is the, quote, homogenized value-added product. Okay? Well, turns out that then when the CRU investigations came out, it was allowed that maybe they did have it. And Phil Jones was asked about himself, and he said, well, I have great integrity, but I do have a problem. I'm sort of paraphrasing here. I'm disorganized and a mess. And besides, yeah, I'm not organized. And so you have to ask the question, what organization would make a person who admittedly says he's disorganized and doesn't know where he puts things to be the keeper of the world's weather records? Well, that obviously happened for a reason, and I'll leave you to fill in the blanks. So anyway, last night, Steve talked about, I think, very important aspects of the ClimateGate emails. I find the following little montage the most important. It was messing around with the canon of science. The refereed literature has got enough problems as it is. If I send a paper in that says the world's not coming to an end, it's going to be reviewed by people who are getting paid large amounts of research money to say that it is. And so that paper is going to have a much harder time in review. And I digress right now. A couple of years ago at this meeting, it was brought up that we should have a refereed journal in which we can publish real science. It's now time to do that. Since ClimateGate, it has gotten worse. It has not gotten better. The American Geophysical Union is extremely defensive about what has gone on. And I know that Roy Spencer, myself, I have 5 manuscripts that have been sitting out there. And when the reviewers get them, they say, you've got to change this or that. And so we change this or that, and they send it back. Oh, now you have to change this or that. Ross McKittrick has written a wonderful chapter in my upcoming book, Metastasis, How Global Warming Invaded the Body Politic. And it's about the problems that Ross and I had with publishing things and correcting the United Nations for saying things that weren't true. So we need to do this, and we need to do it now, and I think time is now. At any rate, here's what happened. This is from Phil Jones to the hockey team. I will be emailing the journal, this is the journal Climate Research, to tell them I'm having nothing more to do with them until they rid themselves of the editor, that's Christophitis, that allowed this to go on. This is more than underhanded. This is very, very bad behavior. Here we are from Tom Wigley. One approach is to go directly to the publishers. In other words, the people who are in charge of the editors,
and point to the fact that their journal is perceived as being a medium for disseminating misinformation. Anything that the hockey team disagreed with was misinformation or wrong. This was the most thin-skinned group of people, scientists, I've ever seen, and that's saying something if you work in academia. I use the word perceived here since whether it's true or not is not what the publishers care about. And then they wanted to go after Hans von Storch, another of the senior editors at Climate Research. And then Otto Kinney, the managing editor, asked Chris DeFreitas to say, what did you do with these papers? How did you review them? And it turns out DeFreitas himself was sending the skeptics' papers out for more reviews than other papers would get. He sent this particular paper in question by Willie Soon and Sally Balonis out to 5 reviewers, all of whom recommended publication. And as a result, when Otto Kinney pointed that out, Mike Mann said that this Kinney is disingenuous. He probably supports what DeFreitas is trying to do. We have to go above him. I think as the community should terminate its involvement with this journal at all levels, reviewing, editing, and submitting. So you understand when you start screwing around with the refereed literature, you're screwing around with what we call truth. You are biasing truth. And how Penn State University or the University of East Anglia could sweep this under the rug is mind-boggling. This is a hanging offense in science, and it was completely swept under the rug. And then it went to geophysical research letters. We had a graduate student who became a postdoc named Jim Sayers. This is from Mike Mann. Apparently the contrarians now have an in with GRL. This guy Sayers has a connection with the University of Virginia. Shoot, that should be great. I mean, when the governor decided to single me out for harassment, where was the faculty senate? They thought it was just fine. It should have been great. Anyway, because he has a connection with environmental sciences, that causes him some unease. I think we now know how papers by Douglas and Michaels and Singer and Soon and all these guys got published. In other words, whatever we got published was because of something wrong, and whatever they got published was, of course, very, very good. So, Sayers eventually left, by the way. His term was up and he didn't re-up. It's truly awful how geophysical research letters has gone down rapidly in recent years. I think the decline began before Sayers. I have had some unhelpful dealings with him recently with regard to a paper, Sarah Raper, and I have on glaciers. If you think Sayers is in the greenhouse skeptic camps, then if we can find documentary evidence of this, we could go through official AGU channels to get him ousted. Do you like that? If the editor is what an editor is supposed to be, a skeptic, we will go above this person's head and get him fired. Like I said, it's a hanging offense. But none of the universities looked the other way when this came up. And then these people thought they had control over the literature. It's a shame, he says here. This is from Mike Mann. What a shame that would be. This is a heads up that something might be up here. It's one thing to lose climate research, but we can't afford to lose GRL. I think it would be useful if people began to record their experiences with the editors on this stuff. So losing the journal meant allowing people like me to publish. And that is why we need a new journal. It'll be online. We'll referee it. We'll try and find a sponsor. If any of you want to sponsor it, it doesn't cost that much. But I know there are a lot of papers out there and a lot of good scientists who right now are being blackballed, and it's time that this sees the light of day. Then we're going to threaten the journals. Finally, I don't believe a response is warranted. The McIntyre, this is McKittrick and Michaels' claims in question are debunked. I'm not sure that GRL can be seen as an honest broker in these debates anymore. Probably best to do an end around them wherever possible. This is probably the journal that publishes the most geophysical science research in the world. Anyway, so much for that. I will close my talk with an email that I happen to be very, very fond of. And the reason that there was so much animosity, Ben Santer was threatening to beat the crap out of me, is because in 1996 he published a paper in Nature magazine which showed an incredible match between the three-dimensional structure of the atmosphere behavior from 1963 through 1988 and his climate model. It was so good that the immediate question I had was, well, the data starts in 1957 and it ends in 1995, and you looked at 1963 through 1987. I wonder why that is, skeptic that I am. And when you looked at all the data, the match fell completely apart. Ever since then, well, I think he needs a course in anger management. Anyway, the response of the community, and you too can get in on this if you want, is you can join the Facebook site, I Want to Beat the Crap Out of Pat Michaels. And as a friend of mine pointed out to me, it's really quite amazing. The first people who signed up were the members of the Cato softball team. Anyway, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak, and now Senator Allen will speak.